Okay, here's Henrietta Maria again by Van Dyck. When Buckingham was assassinated in 1628, Charles was freed from a big liability, but Henrietta Maria was also to be a problem for him. He was 25, she was just 16 at the time of their marriage, but even at that age, she was very serious about her Catholic religion. She had been born just before her father, Henry IV of France's assassination, and so she was raised by her much more Catholic mother, Marie de Medici. And she arrived in England hoping to make an impact on the state of religious affairs there. The king agreed not to enforce the anti-Catholic laws, which had only been irregularly enforced in James's day and even in Elizabeth's day. But since Parliament demanded the full enforcement of them, this had little practical effect. It was, in effect, a standoff, and any public demonstration of Catholicism remained dangerous. The king insisted, too, on raising their children in the Anglican faith, which was another blow to Henrietta Maria's program. But even this was not altogether pleasing to Parliament, which was by this time, the House of Commons that is, by this time three-quarters Puritan and almost as anti-Anglican as it was anti-Catholic. This is another portrait of her by Van Dyck. Parliament was called and dismissed 4 times by Charles between 1625 and 1629. Parliament at this point, as it had since the 13th century, only met at the request of the king. The House of Lords consisted of the members of the nobility and at this time the bishops of the Anglican Church. The Commons consisted of representatives chosen in a variety of ways by a variety of geopolitical entities. In most cases, the representatives were prominent in agribusiness or other business, and their election was secured more by their local influence than by what we would call the vote of the people. Indeed, most of the members of the Commons were not common in the modern sense, our sense at all, and only those citizens who could meet a standard of pretty high property ownership could participate in the selection process at all. Charles's parliaments dominated more and more by wealthy Puritans. It's been estimated that by 1625 the House of Commons controlled at least 3 times the wealth of the House of Lords. It became more and more demanding, and in 1629 he dismissed Parliament and resolved to rule by himself on his own resources. Still, one more picture now of Henrietta Maria by Van Dyck with her pet person, one of her favorite dwarves there. There were certain sources of royal income, monopolies on the sale of such staples or the taxing of the sale of such staples as coal, salt, soap, and beer. And the king tried levying various taxes by royal decree, but by 1640 the government was broke. Moreover, the Scots, whom Charles had alienated by his Anglicanism, which they viewed, like the English Puritans, as a little better than Catholicism, had in 1638 adopted a national covenant reaffirming their allegiance to Presbyterianism and committing themselves to its defense by arms. This amounted almost to a declaration of independence. Charles needed an army to deal with them, but the only way he could pay for it was by calling Parliament to grant him money. This is Van Dyck's triple portrait of the king, which was sent to Rome so that Gian Lorenzo Bernini, about whom we'll hear more in a couple of weeks, could make a portrait bust of him, which was made.
That's a copy of the original bust, which was destroyed in the Whitehall fire of 1698.
And as you can see, by 1640, poor Charles just didn't know which way to turn. The Parliament that was assembled in that year was the most obstreperous yet and was dismissed so quickly that it's known as the Short Parliament. When a Scottish army under Alexander Leslie then crossed the border and became itself a serious threat, Charles had to call Parliament right back again in desperation, and one of the first things this Parliament did was pass an act forbidding its dissolution without the consent of its members. As a result, this became known as the Long Parliament, which sat more or less throughout the upcoming Civil War. This is Van Dyck's portrait of Thomas Wentworth, the Earl of Strafford, who had been one of the king's most loyal advisors and generals, but when Parliament found out he was advising the king to bring in a Catholic army from France or Ireland to support him, he was arrested. Wentworth, the Earl of Strafford, was arrested and executed in May of 1641, and the king was powerless to prevent this. This event and the arrest also of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Laud, the ally of Strafford and the king, effectively meant that Parliament was burning its bridges. There was no going back after these things. In December of 1641, the Grand Remonstrance was issued, which, had the king accepted it, would have amounted to abdication. Charles responded by attempting unsuccessfully to have Parliament's leaders, his main opponents, arrested. And then, when this failed, he left for the north, where his support was strongest, though the far north remained under threat from the Scots, who were to play a kind of third-party game in the Civil War, and Henrietta Maria went to France to try to raise what support she could there. Here's one of Van Dyck's most famous portraits of the king as he looked about this time. Van Dyck is, I think, the most influential painter in the history of English art. If you can hold some of the portraits by him we've seen in your mind's eye for a few months, you're going to see just how much people like Kneller and Lely and Gainsborough and Reynolds learned from him about how the English like to see themselves painted. No one was ever sorry he was painted by Van Dyck. He would always give you the benefit of the doubt, always show you looking as good as you could look on your very best days. Figuratively then, raising his standard at Nottingham, the king asked all loyal Englishmen to come and fight for his rights, and about 14,000 showed up. But Parliament gathered its own force and met the king at Edgehill in October of 1642. This is the battlefield of Edgehill, seen from the mock medieval restaurant now on top of the hill itself. The king's forces were led by Prince Rupert of the Rhine, Charles's nephew, Parliament's forces by the Earl of Essex. Not all the nobility supported the king. Nearly one-third of the House of Lords sided, at least at first, with the rebels, while on the other side, about a third of the commons supported the king. The battle, which was very hard fought, is usually considered to have been essentially a draw, but Essex did pull back, and the king was able to go on to Oxford, which had been his goal, to secure the military supplies that were stored there. This is Van Dyck's portrait of the king's third cousin, James Stuart, 4th Duke of Richmond, who with his 3 brothers supported Charles. James here gave money to the king, but his brother George died fighting for the royal cause at Edgehill, and his other 2 brothers were killed later in the war. This is Van Dyck's double portrait of the brothers of James, John and Bernard Stuart, the ones who died later. As I said, if looks won battles, the Cavaliers, as the king's army came to be known, would never have lost. They charged into battle, lace flying, silk shining in the sun. One of the poets who supported the king was Richard Lovelace, who was arrested by Parliament in 1642, the year the Battle of Edgehill was fought, and while in prison he wrote the famous lines, "Stone walls do not a prison make, nor iron bars a cage. Minds peaceful and quiet, take that for an hermitage. If I have freedom in my love and in my soul am free, angels alone that soar above enjoy such liberty." This was written to Lovelace's then girlfriend, Althea. Van Dyck's double portrait of 2 other fellows who fought for the king at Edgehill, George Digby, the Earl of Bristol on the left, and his brother-in-law, William Russell, on the right, who was to become the first Duke of Bedford, but didn't receive that title until many years later when he was rewarded by King William for his part in the overthrow of Charles I's son, James II. By that time, Russell was in his 70s and lived to be nearly 90. His descendant, the 4th Duke of Bedford, built Woburn Abbey, which we'll see next quarter, and the philosopher Bertrand Russell is also his direct descendant. I mentioned Lovelace earlier, the most famous of the Cavalier poets, and he wrote another famous war-related poem called To Lucasta. Lucasta was a later girlfriend, which has one of the most well-known lines in English poetry in it. Lovelace says, "Tell me not, sweet I am unkind, that from the chaste nunnery of thy breast to war and arms do fly. True, another mistress now I chase, the first foe in the field, and with a stronger faith embrace a horse, a sword, a shield. But this inconstancy is such as you too shall adore. I could not love thee, dear, so much, loved I not honor more." In this double portrait by Van Dyck, we have Charles's nephews, Charles Louis on the left and Prince Rupert. Prince Rupert of the Rhine, as he was known. They were the sons of Charles's sister Elizabeth, who married the Count Palatine of the Rhine, Frederick V, about whom we'll hear more in a couple of weeks in connection with his part in the 30 Years' War. Charles Louis took no part in the English Civil War, but Rupert was one of his Uncle Charles's most loyal supporters and was given credit for the victory the Royalists claimed to have won at Edgehill. It is also Rupert who is said to have given Oliver Cromwell's men the nickname Ironsides. Cromwell had been at the Battle of Edgehill, but it was at the Battle of Marston Moor in 1644 that he really first made a name for himself. Here you see the battlefield of Marston Moor, southwest of York. Cromwell came from a wealthy landowning family and had served in Parliament, but like many of history's greatest generals, he had no military training but much leadership ability. Leadership ability, charisma, like Beethoven's ability to write music, or Shakespeare's to write literature, or Michelangelo's to sculpt, just has to be considered a gift. Cromwell had the gift of being able to get people to do what he wanted them to do that is indispensable in the art of war. That was the form his genius took. Between 1642 and 1644, he had on his own initiative organized and trained and fought small encounters with an essentially hand-picked force that was to become invincible. At Marston Moor, which was one of the biggest battles ever fought in England, about 27,000 Roundheads, as the soldiers of Parliament were called because of their short hair, against 18,000 long-haired Cavaliers. He shared command with Ferdinando Fairfax, but it was his Ironsides that saved the day, and when Fairfax retired after the battle and his son Thomas was appointed commander-in-chief, he immediately made Cromwell his second-in-command. At Naseby here in central England the next year, though Thomas Fairfax was in command, it was again Cromwell's Ironsides that won the battle, and after this defeat, Charles and the Royalists were wholly on the defensive. This is an example of the sort of uniform worn by Cromwell's men, although it's not that different from what the rank and file in the King's army wore as well. After other defeats in 1645, the King got in touch with the Scots in a last-ditch attempt to find support. The Scots had been the uneasy allies of Parliament in the early part of the struggle with the King, mostly because of a common dislike for his Anglicanism. But Scottish Presbyterians and English Puritans did not always see eye to eye, and the King hoped to be able to come to some understanding with them. However, when Parliament offered to pay the Scots a fortune as reimbursement for their part played thus far in the war, and there was a large contingent of Scots at the Battle of Marston Moor on Parliament's side, when Parliament offered to pay the Scots a fortune as reimbursement for all this, if the King were turned over, the Scots made the deal and went home, leaving Charles to his fate. Royalists have always accused the Scots of, in effect, selling him to his enemies in the most dishonorable way.
Charles was turned over by the Scots to Cromwell at Holdenby, or Holmby House, as the English call it, built originally by Christopher Hatton, Elizabeth's favorite, and it was bought from his creditors by James I. Charles was held here from February to June 1647.
It's fair to call Charles brave, I think, but he was not in Cromwell's class as a leader or a soldier. He was brought to London and placed under house arrest at Hampton Court, but not everything was going smoothly among his enemies either. While Cromwell, now de facto commander of the army, quarreled with the various factions in Parliament over what to do next, the king escaped. There were no real precedents for how to handle a royal prisoner, and it was not beyond possibility that some arrangement would be worked out to restore him to his throne. If that happened, no one wanted to be remembered as the guy who locked him up every night, so surveillance was not as close as it should have been. Charles made his way to the Isle of Wight, but the governor of Carisbrooke Castle placed him under house arrest here, pending some disposition of his case by Parliament. His supporters made new overtures to the Scots, and in desperation he agreed to a sort of trial imposition of Presbyterianism as the state religion if they would restore him to his throne. This time the Scots did attempt to help him, but Cromwell clobbered the invading army at Preston in August 1648. After Pride's purge, when Colonel Pride chased all those who might give any support to the king out of Parliament, creating the so-called Rump Parliament which remained, the king was brought to trial for treason before about 65 judges from or hand-picked by the Rump under John Bradshaw, the presiding officer. This is an anonymous picture of Charles at his trial in Westminster Hall. Thomas Fairfax refused to serve on the panel of judges, later quarreled with Cromwell, and was eventually to be one of those who worked to restore Charles's son, Charles II. The king's defense consisted essentially in arguing that Parliament had no right to try him, and that the charge of treason was based on a post facto law, which made it treason to make war on Parliament. This wasn't good enough, and his death warrant was signed by 59 of the judges, including Cromwell. This is the so-called banqueting house, all that's left of Whitehall Palace as it stood in Charles's day. The architect of the place was Inigo Jones, who built it for Charles's father, James I.
Like the Queen's House at Greenwich, which we've seen, the banqueting house, all that's left of Whitehall Palace, is often considered one of the very first significant classically inspired buildings to go up in England.
It was in front of this building that Charles was beheaded, January 30th, 1649. Andrew Marvell, the poet and friend of Milton, inserted a noble description of the King's End in a poem that he actually wrote later to honor Cromwell. Says Marvell, "He nothing did or common or mean upon this memorable scene, but with his keener eye the axe's edge did try, and calmly laid his head down as upon a bed." These lines are said to have helped get a pardon at the Restoration for Marvell himself, and indirectly perhaps for Milton. This is a portrait by Samuel Cooper of Cromwell now, who surprisingly wore his hair long, unlike the Roundheads he commanded. There was an almost immediate popular reaction against the execution of the king, and Cromwell took his army first to Ireland, which had been a constant threat, and there dealt so harshly with the rebels, or possible rebels, or anyone who might think about being a rebel, that Winston Churchill says that, great a general as he was, and he never lost a battle, that in Ireland he nevertheless lost all title to honor. And then he went to Scotland, where the Parliament had proclaimed Charles II, Charles's son in exile, to be the king, and behaved just as cruelly. The Earl of Clarendon, the greatest English historian of the 17th century, sums up Cromwell's character thus. He says he was a brave, bad man. This is another portrait of him by a fellow named Robert Walker. As frustrated by politics as he was successful in war, he impatiently used the army to weed out his enemies from even the Rump Parliament, creating in 1653 the so-called Barebones Parliament, named after one of its members, the memorable Praise God Barebones. And it was this parliament which created him Lord Protector, and for the next 5 years he governed as a military dictator, growing more unpopular by the hour. He passed from being a conquering hero in the eyes of the English people to a tyrant and a tax collector in an amazingly short time. Churchill says that by the time Cromwell died in 1658, he was the most hated man in England, hated by the Catholics and Anglicans and Royalists on one side, by the radical Puritans, communists, levelers, and Republicans on the other. On his deathbed, he named his son Richard his successor, a de facto royalist at last. But Richard had nothing of his father's ability, and when it became clear that a monumental reaction against the policies of the past 10 years was building, he fled to France and lived under an assumed name. Meanwhile, as Cromwell's reputation had fallen, that of Charles I had risen to the point where he had passed from tyrant to martyr to hero, and Parliament now entered into negotiations which would bring about the restoration of the Stuart monarchy and Charles II's son, Charles II, about which event we'll hear at the outset next quarter. This is an anonymous portrait of Andrew Marvell, who had been Thomas Fairfax's secretary and became Milton's assistant after the latter went to work for Cromwell's government. Marvell and John Donne are usually considered the most important writers in the group known, since Samuel Johnson applied this adjective to them, as the metaphysical poets. But this is a difficult term to define, and it seems to me that many of Marvell's best-known poems have at least as much in common with those of Ben Jonson, or Ronsard for that matter, as they do with those of John Donne. His best-known lines are among the best of this century. He says, "Had we but world enough and time, this coyness, lady, were no crime. But at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near. The grave's a fine and quiet place, but none, I think, do there embrace." This is a portrait of John Milton as a young man. Like Marvell, he went to Cambridge and leaned even there among rowdy undergrads toward the Puritan viewpoint. After his graduation, he became known in London as a Latin scholar of special ability, and by the age of 25 as an important poet. He also collaborated with William Law's brother Henry on the Masque Comus. 17th century masques, I think, would look something like a cross between a Broadway musical and an opera today. In his 30s, he became more and more devoted to the cause of religious liberty, and in 1643 to the cause of, as it were, marital liberty, when he published his famous pamphlet in defense of divorce after his marriage to Mary Powell had become a wreck. They were, in fact, eventually reconciled. She died in 1652 after giving birth to their 3 daughters. Milton's only children to live long were by her, his 3 daughters. In 1644, he published his essay Areopagitica on freedom of the press, which is as well known to most students today as Paradise Lost, I suppose. It seems to have been largely ignored in his day, however, which was perhaps to his professional advantage, because Cromwell, who in effect hired him in 1649 to conduct the government's Latin correspondence and defend its policies to an international audience, would probably not have agreed with a lot of what he wrote, if he'd read it. This is the title page of his magnum opus, Paradise Lost, with a later engraved portrait of him on it. Until Cromwell's death, Milton's time was then mostly taken up with this business, and had he not lost his job on the return of Charles II, he might never have had time to write Paradise Lost, what is usually regarded as the greatest long English poem, although, as Samuel Johnson said, no one ever wished it were longer than it is. He was also essentially blind from about 1652 on, which may also have made it easier for Charles II to pardon all the critical things the poet had written about his father. Milton was living in this house at Chalfont St. Giles just outside London when he finished Paradise Lost in 1665. The poem was apparently dictated in his blindness to his daughter Deborah, but his relationships with his daughters were not a model of father-daughter amity. Somewhere along the line he'd missed out on bonding, I think. He was married a total of 3 times, but, as I say, had no more children after the 3 daughters by his first wife. Scholars always point out the effect that Milton's Latin training had on the poem, from the actual style of writing to his conscious imitation of Virgil, and much attention has been paid to linking passages in it to Milton's views on a whole variety of 17th century topics, but for a lot of readers, the most memorable thing about it is the fact that Satan is clearly, in an important sense, if not the hero, then at least the most interesting character in the drama. The story of how paradise was lost. No one remembers anything God says in the poem. All the best lines belong to Satan. And of course, it's Satan who wins. Adam and Eve are corrupted, and Satan gets his vengeance thereby on God. This is the Garden of Chalfont, so it's Satan who says, "In dubious battle on the plains of heaven I shook his throne. What though the field be lost? All is not lost. The unconquerable will and study of revenge, immortal hate and courage never to submit or yield, and what else is not to be overcome? The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell or a hell of heaven. The Almighty hath not built here for his envy, that is, in hell. Here we may reign secure, and in my mind it's worth ambition to reign. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven." Here's a bust of Milton inside now. It's hard to believe Milton didn't realize that he was in fact creating in Satan the figure Harold Bloom calls the most Shakespearean outside Shakespeare. He went on to write Paradise Regained and considered it, not Paradise Lost, his real masterpiece, and is said to have been angry whenever anyone expressed a preference for his epic of Satan's triumph. Well, we're going to leave England now and begin our treatment of the great Baroque artists of the 17th century, the great painters, especially in Flanders and Holland, but it's often said that the man with whom the Baroque period began was the great Italian Caravaggio, who spent most of his adventurous adult life in Rome. And this is a view of the Eternal City now from the top of St. Peter's, about the completion of which we'll hear in a couple of weeks. One could in fact argue that Italy is the source of essentially every great artistic style from the Middle Ages to the 17th century except the Gothic, Romanesque, Renaissance, Mannerism, and the Baroque. And as we'll see when we deal with Bernini in his age, if Rome doesn't produce, with the exception of at least Caravaggio, the greatest Baroque painters, it is nevertheless the home of the greatest Baroque sculptor and much of the most important and influential Baroque architecture. Indeed, despite Rome's contributions to the Renaissance and the multitude of classical and medieval remains there, its real personality as a city is more Baroque than anything else. This is one of Caravaggio's earliest surviving works, and it was probably painted before he moved from Milan, where he'd been apprenticed, to Rome at about the age of 19. Some think he could have painted this as early as the age of 17, in which case it certainly belongs in the Teenage Hall of Fame. Many consider it to be the first important pure still life. We take this kind of thing in art so much for granted now, it's hard to believe that essentially until the 17th century, no great artist had ever painted such a thing. Like genre painting and pure landscape, still life only became a common subject in the 17th century. Just as El Greco's view of Toledo is perhaps the first important pure landscape, though it's not at all a typical sort of subject for him, this is not a typical Caravaggio either, although quite a few of his pictures, especially the early ones, do contain episodes that are de facto still lifes in their own right. For example, this detail from his early Bacchus in the Uffizi Gallery contains much the same sort of fruit bowl. Here's the whole picture now. In this picture you can see illustrated one of the things, the most important thing in fact for which Caravaggio is famous, his use of chiaroscuro, the contrast between light and dark. There are precedents for this, but the typical Renaissance work has no shadows in it at all. Everything looks like it was uniformly lit by stage lights on a movie set. Only really in the work of Leonardo, maybe, do we get something like Caravaggio's feeling for what dramatic possibilities lighting as opposed to just color and form can create. And this emphasis in Caravaggio's work was to have, as we'll see, a tremendous influence that reverberated for a century all over Europe. This particular work has been alleged on little evidence to be a self-portrait, but the subject has always looked more like a geisha than an Italian to me. This is the Palazzo Madama in Rome, the facade of which was built by the architect Chigli onto an older building that once belonged to the Medici and is now the seat of the Italian Senate. It was also at one time the residence of Margaret of Parma, about whom we heard in the Spanish Netherlands, and she is the Madama, after whom it was nicknamed in a way that stuck. In Caravaggio's day, it was the home of Cardinal Francesco del Monte, who was the first fellow to really recognize Caravaggio's talent, and he invited him to live in an apartment here. Now in 1598, the Contarelli family were looking for an artist to decorate their chapel in the Church of San Luigi de Francese, which you see here, just about a block from the Pantheon in Rome. Giacomo della Porta built the facade of this church, and he's the fellow now often given credit for the Dome on St. Peter's by at least a minority of authorities, although Michelangelo is still the fellow most people think of in connection with it. I should also mention that this church is called San Luigi de Francese, St. Louis of the French, because when Catherine de' Medici was Queen of France, she had it built to serve as the church of the French community in Rome. Del Monte was a friend of the Contarellis and recommended Caravaggio, who got the job decorating their chapel, despite the fact that most of what he'd painted up to that time consisted of Bacchuses, flowers, musicians, and he was only 24 with a growing reputation for misbehavior. The pictures Caravaggio painted are on the life of St. Matthew, but the masterpiece of the set is the Calling of St. Matthew. Here the lighting not only makes the figures themselves more dramatic, it is used to emphasize the gesture by which Christ summons the startled tax collector to a new calling. Another thing we see here that becomes a hallmark of the Baroque, although again it can be found much earlier, is the focus on the significance of a single moment at which the action is, as it were, stopped by the artist. Just as most Renaissance pictures do not depend for their effect on lighting, they do not depend for their effect on this kind of intense focus on one significant moment. Mona Lisa can sit there all day. If the action is stopped, it's not stopped at a crucial moment, but at an arbitrary one. For example, the action in Piero della Francesca's battle scenes in San Francesco and Arezzo is stopped, of course, but it's just a random point in an hours-long conflict. It's also pointed out that this is a very realistic treatment of a gospel subject, and I think that's true, but it's not as earthily realistic as some of his other pictures that were so earthy as to be thought disrespectful. As for example, the Supper at Emmaus in the London National Gallery, which you see now. We see here the theatrical lighting and again the dramatic moment with the action stopped, just as Christ tells his dinner companions that he has risen from the dead. This provokes one to start from his chair and the other to throw his arms out wildly. It was the realism of the scene that caught the eye of the monks who'd commissioned it, however. They were especially offended by the waiter standing over Christ with his hat on and looking unimpressed by the Lord's announcement. He's just like, so you're going to have the spaghetti or the tortellini? It was also pointed out that the fruit was out of season. When it was turned down by the monastery that had commissioned it, Pope Paul V's nephew, Scipione Borghese, bought it. This is perhaps the best picture to keep in mind, I think, if you want to remember the things in his work which were most influential: the lighting, the action stopped at the key moment in the episode, and the gritty realism. And don't overlook the fine still life on the table here, too. Another picture which has all of these elements, although no still life, is the conversion of Paul in the church of Santa Maria del Popolo in Rome. Caravaggio's realistic treatment often does not, however, one could argue anyway, extend to the lighting, which is so important to him. The subjects, as here, often seem to be illuminated by a spotlight, almost in the manner of actors on a modern stage. Sometimes it seems, too, as if they just glow with a kind of inner radiance, rather than as a result of any external light shining on them at all. In any case, it is, of course, the dramatic use of light, rather than the realistic use of it, that helps make his pictures especially memorable. In 1606, Caravaggio was commissioned to paint the Dormition of the Virgin for the Church of Santa Maria in Trastevere, but his treatment was found so offensive that the church refused to take it altogether. The Virgin, according to Christian tradition, didn't really die, but entered a state of dormition until she was assumed into heaven. And it was thought that Caravaggio's treatment made her appear disturbingly unlike someone who was just in a temporary sleep. She was not given the benefit of the usual idealized treatment. Since the church wouldn't take it, Rubens, who was on a trip buying and copying works for his boss Vincenzo Gonzaga, acquired it, and as I mentioned earlier, it was part of the collection bought later by Charles I and then sold to Louis XIII and is now in the Louvre. Giorgi Bonsanti calls this the most deeply religious picture of the 17th century, but Caravaggio was hardly a man we would describe as religious himself in his private life. You're hearing some of the work, incidentally, of sort of music's equivalent to Caravaggio, Carlo Gesualdo, who was involved in his share of scrapes as well. Another fellow whose life you could hardly judge correctly based on his work. Well, John Kennedy says that Caravaggio's reputation for disorderly conduct is unmatched in the history of art and is surpassed only in the history of crime. And it was about the time he painted The Death of the Virgin, as it's called, that he got into his worst legal trouble when he stabbed a fellow in a fight over a tennis match and fled to Malta, where he joined the Knights of Malta and painted the Grand Master Alof de Wignacourt here.
His chief accomplishment on Malta was the beheading of John the Baptist, one of his largest pictures. It was commissioned by the Knights and is now in the Cathedral of Valletta. You probably know the story. In short, King Herod's stepdaughter Salome was told by her mother to ask him for John's head. She held a grudge against John, and Herod had told Salome she could, in effect, have any wish granted. It's the only picture he ever signed. His signature is in the blood below John's head, so it may be that this picture had some special significance for him. Be that as it may, some influential critics have called it his masterpiece.
But Caravaggio did not find life in the 17th century equivalent to the Foreign Legion congenial, and left Malta for Sicily, where he got into more trouble. He was apparently nearly killed in a tavern brawl in Naples, and finally wound up at Porto Ercole on the coast of Tuscany. This is David with the Head of Goliath by Caravaggio at an uncertain date. But Goliath is thought to be a self-portrait. He got into some kind of trouble again at Porto Ercole. He may have been arrested for something he didn't do.
No one really knows the immediate cause of his death. The consequences of syphilis, lead poisoning, sunstroke, malaria, or just outright assassination are among the things suggested. In 2010, the remains found in a church in Porto Ercole are thought pretty certainly to be his, and this monument stands there now.
Caravaggio is probably the most outstanding example of the artist's life being inconsistent with his work. But next time we'll hear about Peter Paul Rubens, whose parents' mansion still stands here in Antwerp, and he led a very different kind of life, one of the most successful ever lived by any artist, and he's the fellow who most people think of first when they think of Baroque painting, and we'll also begin to hear about Rembrandt next week as well.